There you go.
Okay. Welcome to the Panther-Lair show as we preview Pitt, Georgia Tech this week. Panthers going to Atlanta for a 7 o'clock kickoff that you may or may not be able to watch in the city of Pittsburgh. Probably won't be able to watch, but we encourage you to find any and all means of doing so. And we're joined now by Kelly Quinlan from JacketsOnline.com. Always a pleasure to talk to Kelly as we do it every year in these football preview things, and now we're actually doing it on video, which is far more awkward than the talking over the phone. But I think we've all gotten used to it at this point, given the uniqueness of 2020. And I wanted to ask you about that to start, Kelly. You know, what's the situation with Georgia Tech as far as attendance? I look, as they having about 11,000 for each game. Is that, what should we expect from the crowd this weekend?
Well, it's going to be interesting because the weather is getting a little bit gnarly. I'm going to actually look at it while we're talking here. There's a hurricane down in Florida that's getting ready to hit, and it always pushes weird weather up here. So right now it's been storming here in Atlanta. It's going to storm for the next couple of days. Supposedly it's going to be nice out. That tends to draw a little bit better. But yeah, they've been drawing between like 10 and 11,000 for the games. They're at 20, 25% capacity. I can't remember which number. And it's weird. I mean, it's not as weird. I went to Boston College 3 weeks ago, and there was no fans, and that was even weirder. So I guess it's sort of like the way I compare it is like going to a spring game, man. Like, like at most spring games, you have like the diehard kind of people and the parents. That's sort of what it is, right? It's like the people that really want to watch the games in person, and then the rest of them are kind of not as interested or checked out or whatever. And it's going to be interesting to me, like to see like how the atmosphere is for a night game like this again, and two teams that have played traditionally close games since Narduzzi's been there. I mean, I think probably all of them have been decided by maybe 20 points, like since Narduzzi's been there. And to me, it's just interesting. The way I describe the ACC this year to everyone is, you have like Clemson and Notre Dame, and then it just falls off a cliff after that. It is a series of mediocre teams playing each other. So Miami can beat people and they're ranked, but they're sort of fraudulent. And then you have like Pitt, Carolina, Louisville, Georgia Tech, Florida State. They're all like the same team that's dysfunctional on some level and like can play up or down to their opponents. And depending on who's available with COVID and injuries, like, or who's opted out, like that's going to determine whether or not they win the game. I mean, it has been the hardest season to handicap. You have Boston College, who's actually like a better team right now. Like, none of it makes any sense on paper. And like every game's been different, right? Because you have like Georgia Tech gets smoked by Clemson, and then plays Notre Dame pretty well, and beats Louisville, who nearly beat Notre Dame. So like, none of it makes any sense. Like when you look at it, normally you can handicap games and do those types of things, and this year is just a total crapshoot.
Yeah, I think Florida State beat Carolina, then they get destroyed by Notre Dame, and then Pitt beats them so bad that they have like players leaving the team. I think Pitt broke Florida State, so it's who knows what's going on. I agree with you. Do you, obviously they're going to go back to the division format. What do you think of how it's gone this year with this single division thing? I think for teams like Pitt and Georgia Tech, it kind of takes a lot of the fun out of it because it seems unlikely that they would finish in the top two in most seasons. But what do you think of this sort of 1 year experiment with a single division?
I think it's a little more interesting. I'm a fan. Like I've been hoping Notre Dame would join the conference because I think you could go to a pod then and play. I actually laid this out on my site the other night. You could play, if Notre Dame joins, you don't need to add another team because right now there's no TV money to make that worthwhile anyways. You don't need to go add Cincinnati or whatever. You can play 3 5-team pods, right, where you play 4 games against the teams in your pod, and then you play 2 from each of the other 2 pods. And you could put like Pitt, BC, Syracuse, and Notre Dame together or whatever. And you could put the Carolina schools and Clemson together, and then Florida State and Georgia Tech and Louisville or whatever together, like teams that have some geography comparisons or maybe make a little bit of sense. And then pick the best out of those teams every year versus right now the Coastal sucks and has sucked for like 10 years now. and the Atlantic's been much better with Florida State and Clemson, and now Florida State's fallen off a little bit. But it doesn't help the league when you can't play like the second best team, right? The second best team maybe 2 years ago is NC State, right? Or I think about the year Georgia Tech played when North Carolina and Miami were ineligible because of NCAA stuff, and Georgia Tech went 6-6 and played Florida State, almost beat them, and then had to get a waiver to go to a bowl game to play USC. So like, it's a weird situation. Like, I think the ACC's divisions don't make any sense, and so I like that they're playing these teams. I mean, I've been covering Georgia Tech since 2009, and I had never been to Boston College until this year, like as a reporter. Like, it was one of the only two schools that had not been in their stadium to cover a game. The other one was Syracuse, which I couldn't go to because of the weird rules they have in New York with COVID stuff. But Massachusetts was a little more open, and so I was able to go. I had to get a COVID test before I went to Massachusetts and fill out all this paperwork and stuff. But it's just to answer your question, it's just I like it better. I think it makes more sense to I would think it's logical to have, say, Notre Dame and Clemson rematch in the ACC championship versus having them play, Pitt or a Virginia Tech team that just lost to Liberty, or whatever it would normally be, right? Like, I mean, think about the Coastal right now. Who would be the team in the Coastal that would be in first place? North Carolina, maybe? Like,
them or Miami, I guess, right? I mean,
yeah, I guess Miami. But like, probably the best teams in the league right now are Notre Dame, Clemson, Miami, and then like BC or Wake Forest, and then maybe Carolina. So like, it's just a weird season, and I think it's stupid that you don't see a lot of these teams, right? Like, I think you should have the ability to play more than the permanent rivalries make no sense on paper either, and that's something, because it's totally unfair that you've had Virginia Tech play Boston College when they sucked, and then Georgia Tech was playing Clemson every year as Clemson was getting better and better, and yet that's their permanent rivalry games. And you had seasons where Duke did pretty well because Duke's draw was Wake Forest, who was like 2 and whatever, and then they play like NC State or whatever in their permanent rivalry game. So like, to me, it's just, I don't know. It's weird. It's a weird situation, and I like it, but I think it'll be interesting to see if Notre Dame gets pushed also into the league now, because I think the TV money is drying up, and I don't think it's coming back anytime soon. So,
yeah, the hard thing about Notre Dame, though, is I don't think it's just about I mean, obviously the TV money is big from them from NBC, but I feel like I read that they would make more if they were to join the ACC. Like, their NBC money's not.
Oh, it's definitely
so
a prestige thing.
Exactly. And you can't put a
right?
price tag on it. I think it's hard to convince them to go if they're like, no, we still think we're better than everybody else,
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens, right? Let's say Clemson and Notre Dame are on the table, and then they rematch, and you have Trevor Lawrence, and you have the 4 defensive guys who were out for Clemson in that game too, that people don't talk about either. And that's a totally different game, right? So, and then they lose and they're out of the playoff. Let's say that you take Cincinnati over them, which could happen. Does that force their hand? I think that's what's going to be the driving factor that moves Notre Dame one way or the other. But think about it, like how much you're already playing. It's stupid because the ACC is already playing these 5 games, right, with Notre Dame. So it's like, it sucks for the schools that draw them. Like, Georgia Tech plays them again next year, so they got to play Notre Dame and UGA. So like, that's a tough draw you're getting from the ACC, and they're playing Clemson now. So you have Notre Dame, Georgia, and Clemson, or 3 of the top 10 programs in the country year to year. That's a crap hand to be dealt. Whereas if you had a different scheduling format, you might not play Clemson every year, and you might not play Notre Dame, and if they were in the league. So I don't know. It's one of those weird things. Like, I think maybe with Florida State being down, that resets things a little bit in the ACC. But I just really hate the divisions. I don't think they make sense anymore. who's Louisville's permanent right? It's Virginia, right? That's who they play.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Because it was Maryland, they lost. So yeah, it's a great rivalry game, Virginia and Louisville. Most of the rivalries make zero sense, right? Like Wake Forest, for example, hasn't played. This will be the first time they play North Carolina this week. The first time they played them in an ACC game in a while.
Right.
Like they actually were playing them non-conference this year and
Right.
last year to just so the seniors on those teams would actually have a chance to play in that rivalry. And that's just stupid, man. Like,
Yeah.
And also the other thing I wonder about too now is like you have all the, and this is something Narduzzi talked about in his presser. Pitt's coming to Atlanta 2 years in a row. Georgia Tech's going to Miami 2 years in a row. Like, how do you reset those things? Like, what are they going to do there?
Yeah.
Like, are you going to go 2 years in a row up, or or flip it? That doesn't really make a lot of sense either. So, like, what is the solution there? I think they need to have a real kind of deep look inside at what they're doing. I think either you need to, if you want to keep your permanent rivalry situation, you need to add a game to the schedule and go to 9 games, or you need to redo the conference structure because it doesn't make a lot of sense right now to me.
See, whenever I think about the 9-game schedule, though, Georgia Tech is one of those schools that comes to mind because they've got the Georgia game already scheduled. You know what I mean? So
sure, it's tough, yeah.
Louisville and Kentucky. I mean, that really limits your options on what you can do, and then you add in the 5-game Notre Dame situation. I feel like that's always going to keep the 9-game schedule off the table. I agree with the permanent crossovers are the problem. If you just kept the same divisions and eliminated the permanent crossovers, you'd see every team once every 3 years, and you'd go to every stadium once every 6 years. I mean, you're not going to get to see every place for every kid, but you're still going to see every team at least, once every 3 years, as opposed to now where, Pitt played Louisville in 2015. They're not going to play them again until, another year or two from now. But I think you're right, though. This year, I felt this about a lot of things with related to how COVID and the pandemic have, kind of opened our eyes to a lot of things we might not have previously considered, like working from home. I keep saying companies never would have experimented with that, but now they're finding out, it can actually work. So more people might end up working from home when as we move past this. Well, maybe, the ACC needed something extreme to sort of break its scheduling matrix for a year so that they would have to go back and reset it. Because you're right. I mean, if they just go right back to where they were going to be, Pitt's going to be going to Georgia, for 3 years in a row. They're going to be going down to Atlanta 3 years in a row, and that's it doesn't seem. I like going to Atlanta. I think it's a great trip, but it's less than ideal. So maybe this is kind of the impetus to sort of reset things starting in 2021, either with a new scheduling format altogether, or just reset the matrix the way they had it.
Well, I mean, I'm an advocate. I've thought for a long time, if with the current format you have, if you took the old Big East teams and kind of slotted them together, and then slotted the old ACC teams together, that sort of made more sense to me, like as a way of splitting the divisions versus this Atlantic coastal crap that doesn't make any sense on paper, where you have like Wake Forest outside of all their rivals in Duke and Carolina, and you have and then maybe make a deal with Virginia and Virginia Tech that they play each other, or whoever it is that gets left on the outside of that situation. But like, to me, it just because the thing is too, Virginia Tech don't have like an SEC game they play every year, or some other school. So you could set it up like to where if it's not a conference year, they play each other as a non-conference game, like, and just keep their rivalry going at the end of the season. Like, that's really the only one that would get sort of messed up in that. Maybe Miami, Florida State, depending on how you split those two teams up. But wouldn't it make more sense to have Virginia Tech and Pitt and Cuse and BC all play each other, that have like some tradition of playing each other, versus, going to play Duke, no one cares about.
Who's the odd man out though? Which of the old ACC teams?
I think you move Florida State probably.
Really, you move Florida State into the Big East division?
Yeah, because I think they may have been the last one to join.
Okay.
If you go back and look at it, I feel like they joined in '93. something like that. Tech joined, and then Georgia Tech joined, and then Florida State joined. Georgia Tech joined in like the 80s, and then, um, you know, I think that you could move Florida State. That would balance the power a little bit, and it would keep Miami and Florida State together. And I think that would be more interesting too if like they were playing for a conference with
Right.
a division. I'm sorry, playing each other in a division, than having them separated, which I think they did because they thought they were going to both be national powers. And it's been comical that really Florida State's been the only one that's done anything.
Yeah.
Was it Miami's first time in the ACC championship? Was it what, last year?
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Um,
so.
you know, so I think you need to examine all of your options, right? Like the SEC is stupid. You have Missouri in the East. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like geographically, they probably should move Auburn, to be honest, like over to the East, and slide Missouri to the West. Like there's just a lot of these weird things that are lost in conference expansion that don't make a lot of sense to me. And I think if you had the old Big East teams together, I think that might rekindle some rivalry stuff, and I think it would make maybe a stronger league.
Yeah. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see what happens going forward. All right, let's get a little more specific and a little more pressing here with this game on Saturday. I want to talk about Jeff Collins, but I want to start with Jeff Sims, the quarterback, freshman coming in, being the starter. We can look at the numbers, team lead in rushing touchdowns, 8 touchdowns, 10 picks, and all those kinds of things. Are you surprised that he ended up being the starting quarterback? Do you feel like that was what was going to happen when he was getting recruited? And, how's he been as the starter for Georgia Tech this year?
It was sort of like a bonus addition, right? When Willie Taggart gets fired, Mike Norvell comes in. They don't really see eye to eye, Jeff and Mike Norvell out of the gate, and he reopens his recruitment. And then Georgia Tech's like, well, this is a good opportunity. They had another commitment who was close to him, and they were able to kind of get in there real quick, get him turned around and pick him up. The guy they had wanted to be their quarterback, Tucker Gleason, still signed. He was the guy that was recruited for the system. They came in the spring. Tech actually had 7 spring practices. The way it works there is we're at every practice, so we were there watching them. Jeff was struggling. It seemed like it was moving really fast for him, as you'd expect, because he came in early, and so did Tucker Gleason. They're both playing. Tucker looked like the better quarterback. And then Jeff used his downtime, right? You had all this COVID time where they're down, school was down. He wasn't having to do workouts or anything, and he learned the offense really well. Came in the spring, and then athletically, he's the most gifted guy they have. And he was able to kind of use his time, and he worked with the receivers on their own, and they would do throwing sessions, and he spent a lot of time in the film room, and he learned the offense. And then when they came out in fall camp, after like a week or two of being in pads, he really just kind of blossomed and took over and hasn't really looked back. He's been, he got sat down a couple times for some bad interceptions he threw, and just to kind of save him at the end of some games. But he's played really well. Most of his turnovers came in a 2-game stretch against Central Florida and Syracuse. And really, they were like, he threw, I think, 4 interceptions that came on tipped screen passes, which was kind of a weird a thing, like big fat man sacks and that kind of stuff. And it's going to be interesting to see like kind of how he continues to develop. This week's a big test, obviously. Early on in the year, too, he wasn't taking sacks. He was trying to force the ball out. Now you play a team that's +8 on the next closest team in the country in sacks. That's really dominant from a defensive line perspective. Georgia Tech's offensive line still in transition from the triple option where you had a different body style, right, and a different style of blocking. So that's sort of that's the key matchup to me, right? If Georgia Tech can manage their offense and score some points, I think it'll be an interesting game. And can they keep Jeff Sims off the ground, right? Like if they do those things, then it's a game. If they don't, then Pitt's going to dominate them. And that's really where their struggles have come, when they haven't been able to keep Sims clean and allow him to throw the ball down the field and back off the defense from the run game. That's been the real struggle for them.
Are they still showing signs of, I mean, you mentioned it a little bit, are they still showing signs of kind of going through the transition from the triple option into something a little more modern?
I mean, I think, to be honest, the one place where I think they've been hurt the most is at receiver, because in Paul's system, he recruited these big, tall wide receivers that would play in one-on-one coverage, and you throw a 50-50 ball downfield. And a lot of times it'd just be wide open because they catch the corners looking in or a safety looking in, and you just be running a vertical right by a guy. Now you have a situation where these guys have to beat guys off routes. It's a quickness thing, really, other than Marion Brown and Nate McCollum, the true freshman slot. Those two slot receivers are really the only super fast guys they have on the outside. And so it gets down to technique and being able to get open and get off your man. And they've struggled a little bit with that. And I think that's been the thing that maybe has hurt them the most in the transition. The running back thing has not been an issue. Like they're as talented as anyone in the country at running back in terms of their depth and the quality of the depth they have. They have three guys who don't play that would be in the two deep at a lot of schools in the country and in the P5. And you have Jahmyr Gibbs and Jordan Mason, who are two of the premier running backs in the ACC, kind of splitting the workload right now. So I feel like they have enough weapons there. The tight end position's still kind of in transition. It's two sophomores, converted long snapper, and a true freshman. Those are their four tight ends. And they just don't have a huge amount of playing experience. So it's going to be kind of some growing pains there a little bit, but that was to be expected, right? That's something that everyone expected with the change. I think the receiver position's been kind of the thing that's been the most disappointing. I think right now they're catching like 50% of their balls or something like that on targets, and they've had a lot of drops. I think they've had 11 this year. That's been disappointing for Sims too. And then Sims has had some overthrows. There were two plays he missed in the Clemson game that were huge. He missed a couple in the Notre Dame game that could have made that more competitive. He's got to hit on those. He talked about it today with us about needing to step into his throws and be a little more confident with the deep ball. He feels like he was aiming it a little too much.
What about the other side of the ball? I mean, you keep an eye on these games, but then you start researching the team, and I mean, you see the stats for the defense at Georgia Tech, and it's not good. It's not strong. And I mean, this is coming, a week after looking at the stats for Florida State and saying, boy, that's not very good either. So, you're looking at, bottom two, bottom three, bottom one of the ACC in a lot of these stat categories. I mean, what have been some of the weaknesses? What have been some of the vulnerabilities for this Georgia Tech defense?
The corners played pretty well, playing man-to-man, and then in the zone. The middle of the defense has been horrible in terms of pass coverage, whether it's linebackers in man coverage, safeties in man coverage, or playing their zones, guys getting out of position, guys chasing quarterbacks or chasing receivers in the wrong spots, getting their eyes out of position. They've had trouble getting to the quarterback. That's been a huge issue in the Notre Dame and Boston College games in particular. They would maybe get a little bit of a rush, but they get out of their rush lanes and open up these big wide spots where Jerkovic or Ian Book would be able to run and get some open space or throw downfield. That's the thing that kind of scares me for Georgia Tech in this matchup, because Pickett's very good at keeping his eyes downfield and extending plays, right? Like, he's not a fast guy, he's not a runner, but he's able to be smart and run when he needs to run and pick up and move the sticks. And that's a huge problem for him. It was a problem last year when they played Pitt too. And, the defense sucks on third down. They're giving up almost 50% of their third downs. Like, that's horrendous. And a lot of them have been third and longs where they just, they don't get any pressure on the quarterback. The quarterback has time to extend the play, and then guys improvise and get open in space. And then voila, you have this big play that was totally unexpected and defense is so much about momentum and confidence, right? Like, more than anything, like, if you feel confident, like you guys are going to stop and you're playing well and you trust your teammates, you're going to play well. And when you don't, it goes south. And that's been the issue this year as well. They've had a lot of injuries. They've lost their starting defensive tackles, played 0 games this year. That was their one returning starter from last year at defensive tackle. Antonius Clayton, who was this big transfer defensive end, 5-star kid from Georgia that signed with Florida and transferred in. He's played, 2.5 games, maybe 3 games. He's not been 100% in most of those games, not played particularly well. Their 6-year linebacker, David Curry's really struggled. He's been sort of the guy that's been caught out of position a lot. And then one of their safeties, Trey Carpenter, who's a senior, had been a tremendous player. He had an injury in the offseason, came in overweight, and just played terrible basically the first couple games of the season, and has sort of been playing himself back into shape. And he finally has started to turn the corner, but he was their big eraser on defense. He was the guy that would make big plays for them, get interceptions or big hits or whatever. And he hasn't really done any of that this year. So they've had a lot of issues. They've just been struck with a ton of injuries too. They've maybe had they've never had the starting defense they expected to have at any point this season. And they've had probably a different group start every single game this season, especially in the front seven.
That's a tough way to go. I saw they were last in red zone defense as well. Is there anything unique about that, or is that just another sort of symptom of the bigger problem?
I think I think that's definitely also part of what's going on. Last year they played a lot better on defense. I think that's the part that's disappointing, right? It's literally the same guys like that played last year. They lost one of the defensive tackles who started some, and then they lost one of the safeties that was kind of a main guy, but that's not a position where they have depth issues. And the rest of the defense is exactly the same, and they're much worse than they were a year ago. And that has people going crazy, and it's one of those things that's been weird because Jeff Collins has kind of made some excuses on his radio show. He hasn't done it to the media yet, but he talked about it being some big transition on defense. And in reality, it wasn't, because they were running the same defense. They ran a 3-4 for 1 year, Paul's last year, with Nate Woody, who's at Army now. But other than that, it's been the same defense for the past since 2012, basically. So it's not a total scheme change or anything. And what they're asking them to do is not that different. Are they lacking guys up front? Yes. It was a weird time when Jeff got here because they had graduated 4 defensive linemen, and then the 5th one passed away in the offseason, unfortunately, leading up to his first year, who was a guy who was going to play in the NFL. And that they've been trying to come back from that, but it's taken a long time, and they just haven't adjusted well in games either. And I think that's been a huge frustration. Jeff's known as a defensive coach. So, again, that's where it gets into when you're a defensive coach and your defense is not playing well, people tend to get more irrationally upset about it, just like when Paul Johnson's offense didn't play well. The people got irrationally upset about that at times. In reality, it's a team game, right? Like all phases of your game have to be clicking. And that's really killed them is when the defense is not holding up there and the offense is playing okay, and then they just can't keep up because they're really young and inexperienced on offense in a lot of places.
Right. I kind of look at, Pitt's offense is certainly its, weakness this season. Like you just described, Georgia Tech's defense has been a bit of a weakness. I mean, does this come down to, whether or not Georgia Tech's offense can move the ball against Pitt's defense? I mean, is that what decides this game, or is it going to be decided, you think, more by, who's got the lesser weakness on Saturday between Pitt's offense and Georgia Tech's defense?
I think if Tech's defense can get off the field, the offense can muster something together with when the defense has played well and they've given the offense more turns, they tend to figure something out. The defense has started really slow in a lot of games and dug a hole too. That's been another issue they've had. Offensively, I still don't quite understand what they're trying to do at times. I don't see the setting plays up or what the philosophy is long term. I think that's been a frustration for Tech fans. And then the other thing which you haven't touched on is the Georgia Tech's kicking game is atrocious. Like place kicking, they're last in the country right now. 1 for 6 on field goals, and they've missed 3 or 4 PATs this year, and had several kicks blocked, and it's comically bad. So basically, it's from the 30 in, you're going for it. They've had a lot of issues in the red zone scoring on offense as well. with false starts and bad sacks and things like that, where they lose points that way. So it's just kind of been an all-encompassing mess, which has been something that's really frustrated fans with Coach Collins and his staff, because the problem for Jeff is Jeff's a super positive guy. He's always recruiting, selling big. So he's like, we're the best. We're going to do things at a high level. We're going to execute at a high level. We're doing pro style this and that, and then you can't kick a PAT. Like, it really frustrates people, especially because Georgia Tech had like 20 years of really solid kicking through 3 different coaching staffs before that. So, and you can go even further back than that. You probably go back to the 80s. So, yeah, things like that are where the frustration lies now in the program, and the fans are a little annoyed. Jeff probably oversold things a lot, and that's tough when you do that. Like, it's better to under promise and over deliver than over promise and under deliver. And he's been a little in the latter category, in terms of the fan perspective. Like, now, I had a realistic expectation. I said that I thought 3 to 5 wins was a reasonable goal for this season, right? And they're still sort of on trajectory for that. They're at 2-5 now or whatever, but um, fans didn't look at it that way. They were talking about how they could compete for the Coastal and all this. I'm like, you got to simmer down. Like, don't get caught up in what your coach is saying. Your coach is trying to sell his recruiting vision and what they're doing and how they're developing players. Don't confuse that for, you know, that this program suddenly here and they've taken this giant leap. It's incremental steps. Like, quite frankly, where he is what Dave Clawson did when he took over for Jim Grove at Wake Forest. It's a very similar situation where you had a philosophical change both in recruiting and what you were doing in terms of offense and defense. And Dave was like, look, this is a long rebuild. And they got better each year incrementally. They were god awful on offense. And they had a good defense the first couple of years, and that kept them maybe alive in some games and kept hope going. And then they suddenly kind of turned this corner, and they've had basically 5 straight winning seasons now, which has never happened in that school's history. But that's sort of where Jeff probably should have been selling, but this was his dream job. I think he was just excited about being in Atlanta and got in over his skis a little bit in terms of, maybe what he thought he could accomplish quickly. And I think it's, been a tough situation for Tech fans since.
Yeah, it's just hard to imagine a coach saying, hey, look, it's going to take us a few years to build it. You know what I mean? I think coaches are just so wired to, to not talk like that. I mean, partially because I think they probably feel like it would be insulting to their current players. You know what I mean? Oh, we're just not where we need to be right now, and that kind of thing. I think Urban Meyer had the quote about, like, it's not about my guys or someone else. They're all my guys and everything like that. It's just hard for a new coach to come in and say, well, guys, give us 3 or 4 years until we can finally start winning. I don't know. It's just not what you hear. It's coaches.
But I mean, the basketball program's gone with this approach, and Josh Fassner took over a team that basically had like 2 guys back that had played in the rotation. Even like he lost like 88% of the offense or something from the previous staff his first year, and he's like, this is a 5-year plan, right? Like 5-6-year plan, and they're now sort of poised to go to the tournament. And it's taken him a little bit longer because of some mistakes made by him and his staff off the court, but that template's sort of there, right? And Tech fans are a little more rational when it comes to that stuff if you can explain to them why you're doing X, Y, or Z. I think with Jeff, he just likes he wants to get his message out to as many people as possible. So he's doing all this press. He's going on ESPN. He's going on radio shows. He's going on podcasts, doing all of these things. And the people who are really into it, the people that are subscribing to these sites, are consuming all of this information, then projecting an idea that the team's better than it is when you still have fundamental flaws on the defensive line. You're still, not where you need to be there. I mean, on offense, they're starting a true freshman quarterback, a true freshman tailback, and a true freshman right tackle. That's tough, like at any level, whether you were playing at FAU or UMass or Alabama. Like, that's just tough to do. Like, and I think those growing pains. I mean, you look at Pitt. How many true freshmen? You got one, I think, starting at the slot receiver, maybe.
Yeah, just the
And
receiver. Yeah,
and that's, I think, the only one on your whole team, other than is Battle Kid starting yet or not?
he's not starting. He got more reps last week because they had a few corners out. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, they're playing more freshmen this year, getting them on the field just because they can, you know what I mean? Using as many games as you want. But no, I mean, as far as guys who are actually making a contribution, it's Jordan Addison, the receiver. He's the only one. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and so the way I've looked at it, and the way I said that, and the way I think Jeff Collins is looking at it privately, probably, is this is a free season, right? You had no idea you were even going to be able to play. So get your kids ready. Try to win early, and they did this a little bit last year. They tried to win early, and then they started playing the kids as the season went along. And I think they're now at this tipping point where they'll start playing some of the younger guys a little bit more. They did in the Notre Dame game, and you've got to build for the future a little bit here at this point. They're not competing for an ACC championship. That's done, right? So now what are you playing for? The bowl record doesn't matter your record for the bowl game, really. So if you're not the last team in the conference, you're probably going to a bowl game with the way the scenario is set up right now. So focus on trying to get better, and get your young guys better, and build up your team so you can be more competitive next year when you have more mature bodies. I mean, their defensive line right now, if you look at the guys who are the number 2 guys, they're all redshirt or true freshmen, right? They're all kids or true sophomores. Like, they're very young at a lot of position spots. So to me, that's where, it's a lot different. Like, when I look at Pitt's defense is all third, fourth, fifth year guys, right?
Yeah.
Your 2 defensive ends are fifth year guys, right? Like, it's a wonder, Rashad Weaver was a 2-star guy out of Florida. They beat USF for, like, and a couple other, like, smaller schools, and they've turned him in. That's a player development piece, right? Jeff Collins doesn't have 5 years of player development on anybody. Like,
Right.
So that's the piece that's hard to compare them to. Like, if you look at Pitt's offense versus, say, Georgia Tech's, it's all juniors and redshirt seniors and true seniors that Kenny Pickett. Like, you're going to be a little bit more effective. And you saw how the wheels kind of fell off of Pitt when Pickett was out, right? Like, Look how bad the offense was during that stretch. And imagine what their record is if you have a healthy Kenny Pickett all year. I think it's a little bit different.
Yeah, it was definitely, I mean, everybody knows that quarterback is the most important position on the field, but going from having Pickett to not, and they lost the game with Pickett, but once you take him out of they lost 2 games with Pickett, but you take him out of the equation, it's a dramatic drop off. And then you saw when they went down to Florida State and they went 41-17 when Kenny Pickett's back in there. I don't think there's, it's pretty clear, where the drop off is. But like you said, that's a 3rd-year starter. That's a true senior who's been playing since his freshman year, and he's been the starter for 3 years in a row now. I mean, that stuff, if fans don't want to put credence in that, they don't think there's any value in experience, but it really is. I mean, it has a significant impact when you have guys out there who've played a lot. And if you don't have that, you're going to have some growing pains, along the way.
I mean, I guess kind of what are the things that have been issues for Pitt this year in terms of where have the flaws been for Pitt's team this season, just overall?
Yeah, the big one's offense. I mean, their offense it's arguably, or maybe not even arguably, worse than it was 2 years ago when they fired the offensive coordinator. They fired Sean Watson 2 years ago, and then they brought in Mark Whipple, and the offense has been worse under Whipple than it was under Watson. They can't run the ball to save their lives. The passing game is more productive but really just from a volume standpoint, because they're throwing the ball a ton more, and they're not scoring any more points than they did 2 years ago. So it's been a big issue. The run game is a major problem. They ran for, I think, 148 yards against Florida State. It was their second 100-yard rushing game of the season. And really just one of only 4 or 5 since Mark Whipple got to Pitt last year. That's a major problem. Kenny Pickett has been pretty good. Their receivers and tight ends had problems with dropping passes, which was a big thing in the Florida State game. They didn't drop any passes, so it's sort of a step in the right direction. But it's really about the offense. The offense just shoots itself in the foot. It was the case last year. It's why they went 8-5 last year instead of 10-3. Is because their offense just shot itself in the foot over and over and over again. It cost them the game They played Miami last year and lost the game 16-12. I mean, you can't lose games 16-12. You give up 16 points, you should win the game. They lost to Boston College 26-19 because their offense couldn't stay on the field, and eventually A.J. Dillon got rolling. And so, it was the problem last year. It's been the problem this year. They had a better game on Saturday against Florida State. They scored 4 offensive touchdowns, which is a big amount for this Pitt offense, but they did them all on short fields. They weren't able to really drive the length of the field at all, which is a little bit of a concern, but it's, given how bad this offense has been in the red zone, it was actually a step in the right direction. They scored 4 touchdowns on 5 red zone trips. So that's been the biggest problem. And then every now and then there have been some issues sprinkled in with the corners and the coverage. The NC State game, they just got beat on some fade patterns to some just tall receivers who just won a physical battle downfield. And then the Boston College game was sort of the same. And then Notre Dame just outclassed them altogether. I mean, Notre Dame has some really good, talented players, and Pitt just couldn't match up with them defensively. They couldn't, they couldn't stop those guys. And so the biggest problem has been the offense, but then the defense, while it's been really good, has had some key letdowns at some crucial points when, it wasn't going to matter in the Notre Dame game. They lost 45-3. So even if you made a few more defensive stops, it wasn't going to change things. The Miami game, they had 5 red zone trips and scored 1 touchdown on those 5 red zones. So that was the problem there. But the Boston College and NC State games, those are both 1-point losses. A little bit better defense or a little bit better offense wins those games. And that's kind of where this team is, which is what has frustrated people. It's year 6 of Pat Narduzzi, and they're still falling short in a game like against NC State or Boston College, who are both probably better than we expected them to be this year, but not, I mean, they're still at a level where, I mean, Pitt should expect to beat them, in year 6 under Narduzzi. And so it's been a lot of consternation about the fact that those games were losses, in addition to getting just smoked by Notre Dame.
I mean, is Whipple sort of on a hot seat yet? I mean, you have Matt Canada's down the street again over with the Steelers. It seems like since he left, they really haven't been good on offense. He goes to LSU, his career goes in the toilet through a series of kind of bad decisions and who to link up with. And then in the same time, Pitt's offense has kind of gone downhill as well.
Yeah, it's been, when they had Sean Watson in 2017 and 2018, they had a really good running game in 2018. They 2,000-yard rushers for the first time in school history, but they couldn't throw the ball to save their lives. So Pat Narduzzi goes out and hires Mark Whipple, a guy who's supposed to fix the passing game, develop quarterbacks, and I think he's done a good job with Kenny Pickett. I mean, Kenny Pickett has become a pretty solid ACC starting quarterback as a senior. And the passing game, like I say, it's improved in terms of volume, but even things like yards per attempt, you're not seeing huge improvements over where it was with Sean Watson. I think Whipple is definitely on the hot seat. When you consider that Watson was here for 2 years and got fired, and the offense is worse now 2 years later, I would have to think that, like, I try to make a point of not, advocating for people to lose their jobs or coming out and saying they need to fire this guy or that guy. But I'll lay out the facts, and the facts are the offense is worse now than it was when Mark Whipple arrived. And Pat Narduzzi has shown he's not shy from firing a guy after 2 years, which is what he did with Sean Watson. And so, I mean, I add those things together and include the fact that this is year 6 for Narduzzi. And if he keeps, he went 8-5 last year and 7-7 the year before and hasn't gotten above 8 wins in a season. And then this year with a 4-game losing streak and the Boston College and NC State games, I'm not saying he's on the hot seat, but his seat is starting to warm up as well. And I don't know if he's going to want to stomach another year of Mark Whipple's offense when it's been as unproductive and cost them wins. It has cost them at least 2 wins last year, and I think you could say it cost them at least 2 wins this year. I mean, you can't afford to have that. And so I think there's probably a pretty decent chance they make a change at offensive coordinator this offseason, even if the offense goes on fire for these last 3 games. I think there's probably a pretty decent chance just because the offense hasn't been good. It's been the weakness of the team.
I don't get the Whipple thing. He's my family's lives around UMass, and obviously I'm more than familiar with Coach Whipple. But like, I don't get where this thing of him being an offensive genius comes from. He helped get Randy Shannon fired at Miami. They were not good. And then other than that, he's been either a head coach or a QB coach, not really a coordinator that much. So. Yeah, it seems like a weird hire. I don't get a lot of these coordinator hires across the league sometimes. He's on that list with like Scott Loeffler of the former BC offensive coordinator, Virginia offensive
Yeah.
coordinator. These guys who keep getting jobs that I don't understand. Like, like it's like an NFL mentality where you recycle the same couple of guys. That's
Yeah.
why I joked about Matt Canada, because that's right in that realm of recycling guys, right? You take a guy that had coached somewhere before or has a connection, and you bring. I think especially defensive-minded coaches often fall into these traps where they hire an older guy that's an offensive coordinator that they respect, that really talks a great game in an interview or whatever, and then offense is this thing that's constantly evolving. And as you look at who's been really successful in college football, right? It's Lincoln Riley's and Joe Brady and all these younger guys, right? That are or the savant coach types that are really good at kind of adapting. Ralph Friedgen's the guy that always comes to mind for me. I mean, look, he came out of retirement and goes to Rutgers and got them to like 10 wins or whatever it was. Like, as an offense coordinator, like those are the guys that you got to lean on. It's these in between guys like Georgia Tech has with Dave Padno, who I feel like is probably on a pretty warm seat. Like, they haven't really established an identity, and it's hard to figure out what they're trying to do. And you have a defensive coach and Jeff Collins who liked him because he was a guy that had success at Coastal Carolina, and he brings them to Temple and they do okay. And then he comes to Georgia Tech, and Jeff sold him really hard to the fan base, and they haven't really delivered. And aside from a few nice play calls, at times he gets too cute for himself and like has played them out, made some huge mistakes in red zone, play calling and things like that. They have the same kind of issue where Georgia Tech, where they can't score in the red zone consistently. It's kind of funny to me, like, to see Pitt going in this. Pitt's one of the schools that drives me crazy every year, because I'll pick them to kind of turn the corner and then they suck. And like, well, they had the season they had last year. Last year, I thought they were primed to win 10 games, like you said. Like, I looked at it on paper, I was like, oh, this is a pretty good looking team. Pickett's been getting better, like, and they have some good receiver. I was like, I like the team they have. And then they come out and kind of poop themselves a couple times. And like, it's just amazing to me, like, how consistent that is in the Coastal, just as a thing as you look across the league. And I laugh just because, like, it's funny. Narduzzi's managed to have Georgia Tech's number other than that fumble game up in Pittsburgh. But the games have been like, last year Georgia Tech was horrible, and they only beat them by 10.
Yeah.
And Georgia Tech literally had no offense last year. It was basically non-existent, and they only won by 10. The previous couple of years were field goals at the last minute of games. They went up in Pittsburgh in part because of a ball that deflected off a guy's hand and goes to a tight end for a wide open touchdown. It's just been like, one weird thing after another. And so it's sort of fascinating to see how these kind of games unfold, and to see where Pitt is, and Narduzzi not really being able to kick them up a level yet, and them having this opportunity where the Coastal has not been good, and you've had Miami and strife, and Georgia Tech in the midst of the back end of Paul Johnson's career, and then into this change, and Virginia being kind of up and down, and Virginia Tech not being the only team that's underachieved even more than Pitt in my eyes in the Coastal over the last few years. So it's just fascinating when you kind of look at this, and you wonder at what point, is it going to be satisfactory to win 6 to 8, 9 games a year for Pitt and not kick it up to another level? That's where Narduzzi's got to be careful, because if he keeps treading water, eventually fans get frustrated with that and push people out. Happened with Paul Johnson at Georgia Tech, where fans started to get frustrated. There would be these peaks, and then just kind of like this plateau over a long period of time of being competitive in the division but not winning the division, not playing for ACC championships. And at what point does that start to catch up on him? So I can imagine he feels a little bit of heat with his offensive coordinator, and this is sort of like an audition for him for these last 4 or 5 games for Mark Whipple for next year.
Yeah, and I don't even know, and again, I don't know what Pat Narduzzi is going to do, but I think, at this point they've got 13 plus 8, they've got 21 games on Whipple's resume at Pitt. I'm not sure if these last 3 regular season games plus potentially a bowl game, I don't know if they can undo what the first 21 were, because there weren't very many good offensive performances in there. And quite frankly, like I said, I mean, it cost them the Miami and Boston College games last year. It almost cost them the Duke game. They went into a shell in that game. The Georgia Tech game, they what was it, 21-10 or something like that? I mean, it wasn't
20-10, yeah.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's not like they were like lighting the world on fire, and they almost, the offense went into a shell at Syracuse and almost cost them that game. They just squeak out of a bunch of games last year because their offense couldn't do well enough. And this year, they beat Syracuse 21-10. They beat Louisville 23-20. This 41-17 game where they beat Florida State was the most points that Pitt has scored in an ACC game with Mark Whipple as a coordinator. So I mean, it took him 21 games to get to that point. So it's not good, and it's a mess, and the fan frustration is definitely there. I think the fan frustration, you could even date it back to 2018 when they went 7-7. They won the Coastal Division, but they lost to North Carolina. Nobody lost to North Carolina in 2018 except for Pitt. They obviously lose to Clemson in the ACC championship game, and then they go and lose to Stanford in the Sun Bowl when Stanford had like half its team out. It was the weirdest year. I mean, they went 7-7. You think, oh, Coastal champions, you should feel like an accomplishment, but you had a 500 record. Who finishes the season 7-7? And then they go into last season, and 8-5 should have been 10-3. I mean, that should have been a 10-win team. They were good enough to do it, even with they played Penn State and Central Florida out of conference, but they still should have been a 10-win team, particularly since they beat UCF. But they were unable to, they were held back by that offense. And then you come into this season, a 4-game losing streak, getting beat by 40 points. These aren't the things that should be happening in year 6. And I think fans are feeling a lot of that frustration. Right now with Narduzzi, I don't think there's any question about it. And it's at a point now where, because they lost to Boston College and NC State, this season is never going to get out of sort of the realm of disappointment. I mean, the die was cast there. They can salvage it from being an abject disaster, which, in no disrespect to Georgia Tech, but if they lose this weekend or they lose next weekend to Virginia Tech, it's going to be borderline disaster, because then they finish at Clemson, probably going to lose that game, which means if they lose one of these two, either Georgia Tech or Virginia Tech, they're going to be 5-6. And going 5-6 in year 6 of a head coaching tenure, when you've got all these experienced guys coming back on defense and you're not really breaking in too many young players on offense, yeah, the seat gets a little warm when that happens. And it's certainly warm from the fans. And I got to think, the athletic department and some of the people who make decisions are feeling that a little bit as well. Now, of course, the cloud that hangs over every one of these kind of coaching decisions is the pandemic and revenues falling, and do these universities really have the stomach to pay a buyout and pay millions to hire a new coach? I think that's going to save a lot of people's jobs. And I don't think, even if it wasn't a pandemic year, I don't think Pat Narduzzi would be fired this year. I think he would last at least another year, even with a disappointing season. But I do think the pandemic's going to save a bunch of jobs this year. And then, you get into 2021, and Narduzzi really is going to have to produce at a pretty high level, or else that next offseason is going to be really interesting.
It's weird too. Pitt doesn't have a game on the 5th, right? And they don't have a makeup game, right? So
that's their off week. The ACC gave the 2 off weeks. The ACC gave them the final week of the regular season. It's one of their off weeks. So they gave them a road game at Clemson, which was not on the original 2020 schedule. They took Duke and Virginia and North Carolina off the schedule, gave them a game at Clemson. Thank you very much for that, ACC. Gave them a game at Boston College, and then gave them their off week in the final week of the regular season. And people wonder why Pitt fans are paranoid. I don't think the ACC tried to screw Pitt, but they got screwed by this schedule.
Well, don't forget, you also played 4 home games to open the season, and 3 of your final 4 are on the road.
Good times.
And all long trips, by the way, too.
Oh yeah. That's
Florida State, Georgia Tech, and Clemson.
Literally, the 5 longest road trips Pitt could make in this conference are on the schedule. Boston College, going to Miami, going to Florida State, going to Georgia Tech, and Clemson. Literally the 5 longest potential road trips they could have. Like, Pitt people were like, we thought maybe they'd send us to Virginia Tech, maybe Louisville, like some of these, Syracuse, some of these places are a little bit closer to home, and instead they sent them to the longest possible road trips they could have to make. So, good times.
That is crazy, and that's I guess excited for Georgia Tech fans who are conspiratorial with the ACC as well. That maybe you're not on as bad a footing as Pitt apparently is, because that's kind of ridiculous. They could have like a full month before a bowl game of no games, basically, because everyone else will be playing the 5th, maybe the 12th. I mean, have they talked about trying to add a game? Would the league let them add a game, like
No,
a bye
no,
game? And
I don't see them doing
financially, I
that.
imagine it doesn't make sense.
No, yeah, I think they're gonna they're gonna wrap it up with that Clemson game and just be done and wait and see what happens as far as a postseason invite. I mean, I still think that there's a feeling. I haven't talked to anybody at Pitt about this, but I mean, look, we're taping this on Wednesday. We've seen announcements today and yesterday. There's 4 SEC games canceled this weekend. I mean, to me, it's still up in the air every week of whether the game is going to be played. Now, Pitt has been pretty good. They went a long time without having any players absent from a game due to COVID protocols. This past weekend, they had one player who couldn't be at the game due to COVID protocols. So I mean, it's all they've handled it well, but at the same time, Pitt's campus is they gave a shelter in place order for students because they had a big like everywhere else they've had a rise in cases that they're tracing back to Halloween parties. So I mean, I say any game there actually get played is sort of an accomplishment, and I don't see them trying to schedule any more games just because what's the likelihood that it actually gets pulled off. So that's just I think the schedule ends with Clemson there, and then they wait and see if there's a bowl game. So.
That could be quite the bummer if they don't win, because really they should win 2 of the next 3 on paper. And
yeah.
What if you could go 0-3, you could go 1-2, you could go 2-1. Like 2-1's what probably the optimal scenario is, but Virginia Tech's been schizophrenic, and Georgia Tech's certainly not like a total doormat. Like they're better than Florida State, so this should be a really interesting game. I'm very curious to see how they play, how they handle Pitt's defensive front, and if it's a competitive game like it was last year, because I think it should be. They're facing like a similar offense for like the 4th straight week. Like, they should be able to at least scheme that up and make it a competitive game. And then, that's just tough, man. I can't imagine like playing, going to Florida State, going to Georgia Tech, and then going to Clemson all kind of in a row with no bye in between. Yeah. And having a bye in the last week of the season. They should have done that to Notre Dame if they're going to do that to anyone.
No, they're trying to butter them up and get them into the conference, man. They're not going to try and screw them over. They want them to although I guess the flip side would be like they could say, well, we gave you that bye so you could be rested for the ACC championship game, and then that would work out for them. But yeah, that's just how it's a weird year, and I feel like there are new oddities added every week to this whole thing, but it's a year I don't think anybody's going to forget anytime soon. So, we'll see what happens this Saturday. But Kelly, thanks so much for joining us, man. This was it was a lot of fun to catch up with you. It always is. I guess if they actually have a basketball season, maybe we'll talk then. I know they're announcing schedules and preseason polls, so I guess it's a realistic possibility. But maybe we'll talk then. And until then, have a great week. Enjoy the game on Saturday, and enjoy the rest of the season, whatever we get of it, right?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
All right, see you, man.